Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Vijay Ramjattan, and I'm an instructor in the International Foundation Program at the University of Toronto. So in this brief video lecture, I would like to discuss how we need to conduct research, not with international students whom we perceive as linguistically deficient, but rather international students who are actually linguistically oppressed. Oops. Forgive me for 1 sec. Okay, so before I officially begin, let me just mention that this lecture, is based on a chapter that I wrote for research with international students, critical conceptual and methodological considerations. So if you would like further elaborations of any points that I make in this video, please check out this edited volume, which actually contains an array of excellent chapters from authors around the world. So this is just my shameless plug for both my chapter and the entire edited volume. So please read it, which is also, and the edited volume is also open access as well. So to better explain the title of this lecture, I want us to consider this quote from Blomer et al. 2005. They say, quote, "A change in spatial environment clearly affects our capacity to deploy linguistic resources and skills and imposes requirements on us which we may fail to meet." So to paraphrase here, it's important to recognize how the physical spaces we occupy can constrain the language practices we're able to use. So at least for me, I think this quote is very much applicable to how we should think about research pertaining to international students and the use of language. So this calls for us to problematize the alleged problem. So when it comes to language, much research is dedicated to identifying so-called deficiencies of international students' language use and offering ways to correct these alleged deficiencies in order for these students to thrive in their academic studies. So keeping in mind the quote from the previous slide, the problem with treating language as an individual deficiency for international students to overcome is that it ignores how these linguistic deficiencies are actually institutionally created. That is, international students do not enter higher education institutions already possessing some linguistic deficiency. Rather, their language practices are made to be deficient through institutional processes within their academic environments. So I call for reconceptualizing the problem. So what I want to argue is that, rather than research ways to linguistically fix international students, scholars should name and challenge the institutional forces that linguistically oppress these students in the first place. So as a case study to support my argument, I want us to use the context of international students studying in English medium universities located in the global north. So while I limit the current discussion to one language and one geopolitical context, obviously due to time constraints and obviously due to the capacious nature of language in general, I do recognize how my focus on English does reproduce the hegemonic status of English in language-related literature pertaining to international students, right? So this is just an inherent fault of my presentation, and the best that I can do for now is just acknowledge it and apologize in advance. But what I want to do for the remainder of this video is just offer you as researchers tips that you might want to apply to your own future research pertaining to language and international students or other related topics. So first, I want us to question the linguistic assumptions behind the label international student itself. Second, I think we need to examine the external perceptions of international students' language use. And finally, we need to recognize the disciplinary context of linguistic oppression. So one way to help challenge the deficit framing of the language practices of international students can begin with interrogating the institutional label of international student itself. So while much research uses international student as a purely legal category, which describes those who travel to another country to pursue either undergraduate or graduate education, Cantwell and Lee 2010 argue that international can also define different levels of alienation. So one way to acknowledge this point is to look at how university language policies reproduce racial and colonial hierarchies among different international students. So in policies outlining exemptions from proving proficiency in English to attend Canadian universities, for example, there is a general tendency to exempt students from imperial centers like the UK and US, while requiring students from such countries as India and the Philippines to prove their proficiency, even when histories of British and US colonialism have made them highly proficient in the language. So these policies make some students, quote, more international to certain universities than others in terms of having to legitimate their variety of English. So we see coloniality at play here, right? So some international students are made to be more international, right? Or more foreign to universities, and they need to prove their English. Conversely, this coloniality positions certain other international students, like from Australia, the UK, US, as less foreign, less international, because they have this English that's perceived as, a pure or true, so-called pure or true kind of English. So what does this all have to do with research then? So I think understanding how language policy can make international a shifting category is vital for researchers who use international student as a blanket term for multilingual students who struggle with using English. So using this term in this uncritical manner ignores that English is not necessarily a hindrance for every international student. For instance, Shireen Bala notes that even if their English is unfairly scrutinized, as I mentioned before, Indian students often have an easy time linguistically adjusting in US universities precisely because they are recipients of a British colonial education, which obviously required them to use English on a daily basis. So through interrogating the institutional label of international student, future research can explore how linguistic deficits are made by higher education institutions rather than brought in by people like international students. So just as university language policies can dismiss the English proficiency of particular international students, representatives of universities, such as faculty and staff, also contribute to this dismissal through their everyday perceptions of these students' English. So faculty and staff perceptions of international students' English can be informed by what are known as racial linguistic ideologies. And these are ideologies based on European colonialism, which posit that the language practices of racially minoritized groups are deficient even when they match those of their privileged white counterparts. So racial linguistic ideologies is a term coined by the work of Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores. So if you're interested in learning more about this concept, I encourage you to read their extensive body of work. But moving on, in a study examining how English is constructed as white property in a Canadian university, for example, Sturzek 2015 describes an incident where the thesis committee of a Chinese student immediately started to correct the English of the thesis, even though the student's so-called native English-speaking supervisor had already proofread the thesis. So here the committee members were perhaps subscribing to a racial linguistic ideology, stating that the student's English was unintelligible because it was produced by a Chinese person. So with racial linguistic ideologies, right, we can't separate language practices from the racialized bodies that produce these practices, right? So if I have a negative perception of Chinese people in general, right, I'm going to have a negative perception of their language practices, even if they're doing something that's perceived as a privileged way of doing language, right? So racial linguistic ideologies intertwine language practices and racialized bodies once again. So I think drawing on conceptual vocabulary like racial linguistic ideologies can help to move away from research which assumes that international students only need to aspire to a hegemonic linguistic norm in order to avoid critiques about their language practices. So while studies may explore the linguistic discrimination experienced by these students, their weird and eluded solution to this discrimination is actually linguistic assimilation, which ignores how international students cannot necessarily escape racial linguistic ideologies by changing their language practices, and once again reinforces the idea that their English is somehow inferior and in need of remediation. So by acknowledging the intertwining of language and race, future research can better detail how the alleged linguistic deficiencies of international students are ideologically produced by external perceptions of their racialized bodies. So one final piece of advice for researchers is to recognize how academic disciplines can aggravate linguistic oppression. So existing research doesn't really seem to appreciate how international students in different disciplines do not necessarily experience the same levels of such oppression. Rather, some may experience more linguistic oppression than others, right, in certain contexts. For instance, because engineering upholds the white cisgender man as a prototypical engineer, I've noted how the speech accents of international students in this field can be criticized for not only not sounding masculine enough, but also not sounding white enough, right? So there's this double oppression that's happening here. So this small example warrants further consideration of how disciplinary beliefs, etc., intensify linguistic oppression by creating additional linguistic norms to which to conform. In terms of research, I think it's worthwhile to ask more nuanced interview questions to international students. For example, if a student is pursuing two majors, you can simply ask them whether one major upholds stricter language standards than the other, right? And you can obviously get a better, more nuanced sense of how linguistic oppression maybe ebbs and flows in different disciplinary contexts. I should also state that asking such questions has the added benefit of not presenting international students as perpetually passive victims in the realm of language. In fact, if they're situated in a discipline that doesn't pressure them to use language in particular ways, then these students then can offer insights into what international students in general do not need to do linguistically, rather than what they're expected to do. So I think, once again, this lends further support when arguing that there's no inherent deficiency in their current language practices. So let me start wrapping up by offering some brief concluding points. So first of all, by encouraging researchers to investigate the institutional processes that linguistically oppress international students, my suggestions for research obviously overlap with suggestions for institutional change. And this is because, at least for me, reconceptualizing the relationship between international students and language should always have a social justice mandate, right? So I'll leave you with this question to ponder with regard to your own research. But basically, what good is linguistic research and research in general if it's not being used to challenge the status quo, right? So when we're studying topics like international students and language, right, we're not doing so, right, or we shouldn't do so just for the sake of novelty, right? We should have a purpose of, materially changing the lives of international students in terms of their language practices or whatever other aspect of their identities and social worlds. So with that said, I will stop there. These are just the references that I've used in my slides today. You can find all of these references in the chapter that I wrote for research with international students, all with the exception of the Blomer et al. Article. If you have further questions or comments for me after watching this video, here's all of my contact information. And finally, thank you very much for watching. So I will stop it there.